Indulge me, please, in an act of imagination in considering an alternate history for the United Kingdom of Great Britain. A history that begins with the loss of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, then a series of civil wars, disuniting the island of Britain once again into the nations of Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and England. And the British Empire that would have been instead collapses into a small island state of neo-feudalism. The royalty and aristocracy of England, without its empire to distract it, re-enslaves the people of England back into the feudal system. And by early 1900, instead of a great industrialized power with an empire that covers a quarter of the planet, England is just one part of an island off the coast of Europe, a Europe that still falls into wars in the early 20th century, but now the state of England aligns itself with Germany and throws itself into a World War I, where it is roundly defeated by the continental powers. And by the mid-20th century, England is in full economic collapse. And a writer by the name of JRR Tolkien, embittered by his experiences in the Great War with the continent of Europe, writes a fantasy that will become known as Lord of the Rings, and creates a mythic world that will be called Middle-earth. And in this Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth, J.R.R. Tolkien imagines a reunited kingdom that then goes forth and defeats the powers of Mordor across a clear allegory for the continent of Europe. And the power of this fantasy, combined with the desperation of the English people, rises up Tolkien's Lord of the Rings to the status of a nationalist fantasy. England, under a series of tyrants and dictators, rebuilds its power and sends out armies across the island of Britain. It conquers the other nations to form the reunited kingdom, and then sends its soldiers out across the channel to do war once again in the neighboring states of Europe. And the soldiers of the reunited kingdom are clad in white, are emblazoned with the tree of Minas Tirith, its branches intertwined with the mystical symbol of the swastika. Welcome to the Science Fiction Podcast with Damien Walter, a podcast not simply about the very best in science fiction storytelling, but about what happens when logos meets mythos, when reason meets imagination, when science meets fiction. And today's episode is something of a deep dive, maybe the most challenging episode to date that I have tried to record of the science fiction podcast, to look at what happens when science and fiction are misaligned, when logos and mythos come into conflict, and our powerful myths take control both of us as individuals and of our societies. As you might imagine, topics this challenging take a great deal of research and consideration and commitment for me to tackle. So if you find value so far in the science fiction podcast, then please consider becoming a member. You can join for any monthly donation and you will receive access to the members only RSS feed for the podcast. You will receive full access to my courses, The Rhetoric of Story and Writing the 21st Century Myth, and a number of others, including a new course that I will not yet give you the details of, but I'm very excited to be working on. We're still now at the tail end of our pre-membership phase because I've been trying to confirm exactly what membership will include. And I'm happy to say that membership will be including some invitations to participatory online events. I thought long and hard about what I think will work best as an interactive format to continue to build the conversations that are starting in the podcast. And I thought about a number of different ways to do this. And I think that interactive events, talks, seminars are the way to do this. I think they will be crossing over a number of platforms, but as a member, you will be invited to directly participate in those events. And I hope that perhaps the first one, if I can organize it, will be to extend the conversation on today's podcast, which brings together a lot of the thinking that I have been doing across the first year of the science fiction podcast and across Writing the 21st Century Myth, my course in advanced science fiction and fantasy storytelling. So please forgive me if today's podcast is a little bit less polished or if I have to circle round a few times to make my points. I hope that neither of those are the case, but they might be, because this is a big and more importantly, complex and somewhat thorny topic. In a way, this is a second part of last week's podcast, which was made in response to, I think, what must be called the First War in Europe, full-scale armored infantry warfare of the 21st century, without doubt, and really for the last 70 years, a war that has echoes, undoubtedly, of our visions of World War III that we envisioned in science fiction, but we were very fortunate not to experience. And now the generations who remember the fears of that war and the younger generations who perhaps do not, who are catching up with it now, are once again confronted with this vision because of the actions of Vladimir Putin's Russia. And I want to make that separation because it seems clear to me that whilst, any number of Russian citizens may be being misinformed about this aggressive war against Ukraine, I don't believe that ultimately they are going to support it. And this seems to be the act of an extremely aggressive and what's becoming clear, delusional government under the dictatorial, tyrannical control of Vladimir Putin. And we're watching something happening in Russia that now looks very much like things we have seen happening in the collapse of other industrialized societies, not least, of course, the collapse of Germany post World War I, its reformation, and then subjugation to the Nazi regime. And so much of what we're seeing now in Putin's Russia is very, very reminiscent, the same pattern repeating from the rise and destruction of Nazi Germany. And I want to try to dig into this by answering a question that is often asked about this great British, English, Anglo-Saxon mythic story, the mythos of Middle-earth, Lord of the Rings, and JRR Tolkien's incredible, epic fantasy. And to interrogate the question of whether Tolkien's fantasy is a fascist fantasy. There will be people, many people listening, who at that suggestion, perhaps simply seeing it asked in the title of this essay, will have rejected it. Simply rejected it, even as a question. Don't even ask that question, because there is so much beauty and we have so much love for the mythos of JRR Tolkien. And I can certainly feel for that position, but I want to put it aside. And I want to put it aside for a reason, because I think to really understand J.R.R. Tolkien's work and its connotations in the context of a world of rising fascism, once again, it's a valid critique of Tolkien to say that Tolkien's mythos looks potentially fascistic. And I want to dig in and seriously question that. I want to, in doing this, use a few terms for the growth and development of our society. Long-term listeners of the science fiction podcasts, or people who've come particularly from my interviews on the Rebel Wisdom podcast, or with Zubin Damiana, the Z-Dog MD, rapping medical doctor, will be familiar with these terms. And they're a simplified model of thinking about the growth and development and evolutions of our society and for a long time, but particularly in recent centuries. And these are the terms of the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. And that we seem to be going through a transition from the pre-modern, the state that our society was in, arguably for many thousands of years, into the modern, the state we have been in for, let's say, some 300 years. You could extend it to 500 if you want to, where we have been entering some kind of different era that we call the modern, primarily driven by science and technology. And then the progression into something that is most widely called the postmodern, some societal state beyond the modern that is often imagined to solve some of the failings of the modern world. These three terms I'll be using again and again: the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern, because these seem to be central to understanding what's happening in our world at the moment and the importance of fantasy, the very long-term importance of fantasy to our world. Because in the pre-modern world, all societies were based on a fantasy. We could be more constructive and call it a mythos, but I think it's also fair to call it a fantasy. Every human civilization, from the ancient Greeks to the slightly less ancient Romans, we go further back and look at the Assyrian Empire, the first Babylonian cities. I could continue with a list of ancient civilizations, but one thing in common across these civilizations is that they had a shared story, a narrative. I often talk about this. I'm just reiterating it here. A story, a narrative, a mythos, a fantasy. because it was impossible to know what was happening in the world. It's hard to place ourselves back into the ignorance, the lack of knowledge is a better term. How little knowledge the Assyrians or the Greeks or the Babylonians or the Romans had. And they had some progression of knowledge. The Romans knew quite a lot more than the Assyrians did, but they still knew very little, and ordinary people knew very little. So to bind everyone together, you had a story. And this story contained many simply fantastical elements, invented histories, founders of cities who never existed, gods who were personifications of idealized archetypes of human behavior, but in their manifestation were fantasies, heroic figures from the history, even the names and the symbols used by such civilizations. It's mythic stories, like the great myths of the ancient and classical Greeks. Okay, this is all a fantasy woven together to give everybody a shared identity. And that's the only way that humans were able to live for thousands of years. And it was in the construction of these shared stories, narratives, mythos, fantasies, that humans went from wherever this began, presumably when we were plains hunter-gatherers and we started building larger and larger human tribes, communities, polities. We had to have some shared identity, and it came from these fantasies, and this is how we lived in very unified communities. It's questionable how much individual identity anybody had for thousands of years, because we were submersed into these mythic narratives, these fantasies. Okay, and now we were trying to live very differently. We are trying to leave these fantasies behind and live in the modern world. And this is an incredibly complex transition to make. And very often we fail at making it, both as individuals and as civilizations. We try to step into a world that is driven by reason, driven by science, driven by technology, by objectivity. But when this goes wrong, there's an incredible temptation to fall back to the pre-modern and the fantasy that shaped the pre-modern. And this is the essence of fascism. Fascism, from its early development in Western Europe, the specific word fascism comes from Italian fascism. And it is a symbol used by the Romans that for a bundle of sticks that were all tied together and were therefore stronger. So, it was connoting, symbolizing unity once again in a shared identity. But of course, after hundreds of years of the modern project, Italy, which fell to fascism, Germany, which fell to fascism, fascism, which almost arose in many other nations, they didn't have a fantasy identity anymore, not a strong one. So it had to be synthetically recreated. And the pattern you see across fascist, Nazi nations, I'm going to think first about Nazi Germany here, is the recreation of a fantasy which facilitates the return, in a sense, to the pre-modern state. Because if modernism has failed, if the project of becoming the modern world collapses underneath you, as it did in Nazi Germany, the temptation is to try to go back to the pre-modern. Modern Germany was a young nation anyway, and its full national identity had brought together many states and principalities under one national identity. It had then sought to build an empire. It had lost the war to build that empire, and that crippled the economy. I'm simplifying here somewhat. It crippled the economy of Germany, and it was left, a failed modern state. So when the Nazis under Adolf Hitler came to power, they did that by weaving a fantasy of the Third Reich. And they wove into it these powerful symbols. The swastika, the Hindu mystical symbol, which has a wide array of meanings actually in Hindu culture, and isn't even in Hindu culture entirely free of these nationalistic associations. It's a complex symbol, but it's picked up, it's made a primary mystical symbol of Nazi Germany. The Ubermensch, the Superman, which leads the Nazis into their programs of eugenics and their horrifying Holocaust against many peoples of Europe who they thought needed to be eliminated so that the master race could be brought to life. The horrors of anti-Semitism and the near destruction of the Jewish people were all made possible by this potent fantasy of Nazism that gave the German people who bought into it, which was not all German people by any means, let's give credit there, but the ones who did fall into this fantasy, the idea that they could return to the pre-modern world, they could live as a unity, they could live on the land, they could return to old social hierarchies. These are all the concepts woven into the fascist fantasy. And what's terrifying, genuinely terrifying about our current situation that we find ourselves in now in 2022 is we see once again the construction of this synthetic fascist fantasy around the nation of Russia. Russia has been through a similar collapse from the modern project. You have the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, a long decade of the 90s where the Russian people are subjected to yet more incredible poverty, suffering, violence, being dominated essentially by the mafia. And what arises out of that, again, is a strongman leader, which nobody denied that Putin was once he started to take that role. Initially, Putin made far more claims than a figure like Adolf Hitler ever did to, honoring the principles of modernity, democracy, of liberalism. His claim was that was where he wanted to take Russia. Whether that was true or not, it's clearly not where he has taken Russia. And he has taken more power. He has become a totalitarian leader, dominating every strata of what had for a short time been a democratic society. And the fear now is, until this invasion in Ukraine, it seemed as though Putin was at least a rational actor and could be bargained with rationally. But now what seems to have been unleashed are the worst fears of the worst critics of Putin and those who surround him. That in similar form to Nazi Germany, post-Soviet Russia under Putin has woven a fascist fantasy, a fantasy of a pan-Eurasian empire, stretching from the Mongolian steppes all the way to Dublin, taking on all of Western Europe, stitching together one empire, a neoconservative, a fascist empire, to fight literally the modern world of liberalism, of capitalism, of the United States of America. And this is terrifying because if true, and of course it can be questioned, but if true, it means that Putin and Russia are far more dangerous than was generally understood. Dangerous in exactly the same kind of irrational, aggressive, expansionist way that Nazi Germany was. You can read more deeply about the new fascist fantasy of Russia. I've learned a little bit more about it recently from the Rebel Wisdom podcast. My good friends there, David Fuller, who interviewed Gary Lachman on the subject. Go and look that up. And then read a bit more deeply into Alexander Dugin, who, interestingly, was a far left Bolshevik who went all the way around the circle into the far right. And there's a lot to be said about the relationship between these two political delusions of the far left and the far right. And Alexander Dugin is, in a way, the intellectual architect of this idea of the Eurasian Empire. You could call him like a Joseph Goebbels-like figure, that he is providing a lot of the intellectual framework and then the propaganda that is rolling out this fascist fantasy. And you can reach the roots of this back all the way to Nikolai Fedorov and the Russian cosmos, who had a vision of a future for the world, for all humanity, a vision very relevant to the science fiction podcast because it was so science fictional. And it's often cited as early transhumanism, the idea of escaping the earth, escaping the physical bonds of human civilization, escaping the flesh into virtual worlds, into machines, robot bodies. This is the mythic root of the fascist fantasy that does very possibly seem to have taken root around Putin and his close circle. So they're no longer acting for rational reasons. They're acting to take Russia back to the pre-modern. The emotional core of this is a rejection of the modern world, which in a way, Russia has been very wounded and damaged by. Modernity has seemingly done a lot of harm and not very much good to Russia. So you can see how people would say, we want to return to pre-modernity. We want to return to order, rigid hierarchies, a unified identity around the nation, a clear story that everybody sticks to. Life on the land, a strong ruler, the return, for Russia, this is the return of the Tsarist state, the return of the king. Which brings me to Lord of the Rings and our opening fantasy, alternate history of a Britain that experienced some of what Nazi Germany or post-Soviet Russia have experienced, that experienced loss and collapse in the face of modernity. Britain is distinguished in a way by being the country that has arguably benefited most from modernity, that sees the most benefit in building a new society around science, reason, technology, eliminating fantasy, eliminating the mythos. And you can potentially see why, with good reason. But in the midst of this, British culture, through JRR Tolkien and others, C.S. Lewis would be another good example, and then Western culture as a whole through science fiction and sci-fi and fantasy and horror and video games and role-playing games, all of this complex of things that I talk about under the banner of science fiction for the science fiction podcast, much as we have in the West embraced modernity, we also have this new mythos, this fantasy, calling back to the pre-modern or imagining a new future ahead. And most potent of these fantasies is Lord of the Rings. So it would be quite easy to imagine a Britain that had a much worse 20th century that was repeatedly conquered, that collapsed into feudalism again, as Russia had, that was then taken over by a fascist fantasy, as Nazi Germany was, a fantasy built around Lord of the Rings in the way that Germany was built around Wagner, an influence on Lord of the Rings. And there's a lot of the ideology of Lord of the Rings is in those opening chapters about the Shire and about hobbits, where we learn things about hobbits, like they don't like technology. They're capable with machines, but there's a certain limit of technology, and they've stopped there. They like a plow, they like some kitchen implements, but they're not going to invent the smartphone or the machine gun. They're not going to confuse their conservative society. It's interestingly, the Shire is a libertarian small government society. They don't like government. They have very limited police. They have a small army of bounders who patrol the boundaries. I'm rereading Lord of the Rings at the moment. I think it might be the first time I've read it properly for 20 years. Actually, I read it 4 or 5 times when I was younger. To relearn all of this material about Lord of the Rings. And there's a very telling line in Lord of the Rings where, after the return of the king, Aragorn, Strider, the area of Gondor, Rohan, and the Shire and other areas are now called the Reunited Kingdom under the king who has returned. And it would be so easy. In fact, I discussed this with Adam Roberts in our recent interview. I strongly recommend, if you haven't listened to the Adam Roberts interview, although it is now up in our top 3 episodes for the science fiction podcast, but if you haven't listened to that yet, go and listen to it, because Adam Roberts is an absolutely top-level thinker on all of these subjects. He's a brilliant academic, a brilliant science fiction writer. He combines the minds of both into an amazing thinker. And we spoke quite a lot about myth, the Jungian archetypes, and Lord of the Rings, and the worries of many critics of Lord of the Rings, that when you look at it objectively, Lord of the Rings looks a lot like the kind of synthetic fascist fantasy that took over nations like Nazi Germany, or now we fear post-Soviet Russia. And so that's a very valid critique to make. And I think it's one that you can't just put aside. It was really Tolkien's stated aim, another thread that I pursued for a number of episodes of the science fiction podcasts, and also the lectures for advanced science fiction and fantasy, writing the 21st century myth, as that course is subtitled. It was Tolkien's stated aim through the process of mythopoeia, which really he invented. He took that term and defined it, really, to create a new mythos for the modern world, because we had lost our mythos. So much about Lord of the Rings seems to fit the template of the fascist fantasy. But I do not believe that it is a fascist fantasy. I believe it is so much more than that. And in every way that the fascist fantasy fails, I think Lord of the Rings succeeds. So here will be a little test of my critics for this episode. If you're screaming about me about calling JRR Tolkien's Lord of the Rings a Middle-earth fascist fantasy, I'm not calling it that. But I am saying we have to interrogate that question deeply. It cannot be simply dismissed because of the very real fear of fascist fantasies arising to try and roll back society to pre-modernity. But there is, of course, another vision. There's not only this fantasy fascist vision of going back to the pre-modern. There's also the vision of modernity itself. and beyond that, the vision of post-modernity. And I'm going to speak about these in a slightly contracted, condensed format. So I apologize if you don't find the argument entirely convincing here, but I don't want to spend too long on this, but I'm happy to answer more questions about it. But in the pages, and then on the flickering cinema screen, and then the video game pixels of science fiction in its widest sense, we have been developing this new mythos of modernity and then post-modernity in science fiction. This has been one of the great achievements, but also in a way failings of science fiction. We developed first the vision of a modern world, a new world, a brave new world of the modern, which hints at the criticism of this world. And this was the world, where nuclear energy would give us unlimited power. It would power our kitchen gadgets, it would power flying cars, it would power space rockets. We would go into space, we would colonize other worlds. Technology would give us, much better standards of living. And this is, in essence, really, this is the mythos of the United Kingdom for hundreds of years, and then of the United States, and then of the Anglosphere, and then really of the Western world. The Western world is modernism. Modernism is the Western world. It is science, it is technology. The political model is liberal values, so that these different nations can coexist together and all enjoy our progress into the future of getting things better step by step using science and technology. But there's a criticism, a very profound criticism, really at least two. One is made by Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, because he's saying that this brave new world of modernity sucks the meaning out of life, and it leaves human beings as spoilt children, as nihilistic, potentially violent. It means that we no longer believe in anything, so we're only able to just continually comfort ourselves, to put ourselves into a somatic dream state that we now do with Netflix and video games and prescription opioids, of course. So, it's a very valid criticism. The bottom line is that modernity, whilst you can strongly argue, and I agree that it's an improvement, it's by no means a viable end state for humanity. We can't stay in this world of shopping malls and Starbucks and McDonald's, because the consequences are poor health and poor mental health. And there's also the criticism that much of this story is built on a vision that is impossible. Another thread of the science fiction podcast, that really from the Apollo moon missions onwards, we see more and more the collapse in belief that we're going to go to other worlds, because we understand that not only are they incredibly far away, but we face the barriers of Einsteinian relativity in getting to them as well. We fundamentally, space and time are not how they appear in the locality of Earth. They are something much weirder and stranger. The bottom line being that this vision of simply continuing modernity out into space infinitely doesn't work. So the modern vision, which is problematic enough whilst having great strengths, then becomes the postmodern mythos of science fiction, which is umbrellaed under the term transhumanism. Not a new idea. We go back to Nikolai Fedorov. That what we start to do is to say the modern project has failed, it has trapped us in capitalism, so we must create a utopia. This, of course, gives you communism and Marxism and strands of fascism as well, which are also utopian. But Nazism, there is a difference, okay? This argument about Nazism, fascism, and communism. Are they the same thing? Well, the issue is that they stem from the same thing, which is the failure of the modern project, but they go in different directions. Fascism goes back to the pre-modern and all its brutalities. Communism goes to the utopian. The left wing goes to the utopian. And we go to ideas of, through science fiction, a singularity. We can arrive at some kind of technological singularity where technology will explode and allow us infinite potential, which will allow us to do things like upload our personalities to the cloud. I know it seems ridiculous when you think about how poorly Google functions, but yes, that's the idea of the transhumanists and the singularitarians. We can have cybernetic implants that will meld us with machines. If we have a prophet of the transhuman in the world today, it's none other than Elon Musk, offering to give us his Neuralink devices to create this transhuman utopia where we will be liberated from human civilization, which is seen as a negative force degrading humanity, and even from the human flesh and the limits of identity. There is no coincidence that as transhuman myths and the postmodern ideology have grown, so have various ideas about transcending human identity, which are now very deep in our ideas about the future of human society. But of course, there are many criticisms of this postmodern vision. I think the strongest is William Gibson's Neuromancer. Neuromancer, a much misunderstood novel in a way. It was a nightmare vision of the future, but is somewhat adored by fans of cyberpunk and transhumanism, who see it more as a map of where we might be going. I fear Elon Musk is among those numbers, as is so often the case. Writers like William Gibson, Neil Stephenson, who are really, I wouldn't even say it's warning, they are visualizing what this will mean. If you are terrified by it, you should be warned by it. And many people are terrified by the transhuman vision. It is not a dream for most humans to have their limbs replaced with cybernetic limbs or to be uploaded to a clunky computer instead of having the miraculous existence of a biological form. It's a nightmare. Transhumanism is potentially a terrifying nightmare that many people are running from. And where do they run to? They don't run back to the modern, which has already disappointed them, which has collapsed underneath them. If they've lost their job in a technological revolution, if they are alienated from their friends and families by the scale of mass society, all of these problems of the modern leads more and more people back to the pre-modern. This isn't only a historical artifact of Nazi Germany. This isn't only a modern day problem happening in post-Soviet Russia under Vladimir Putin. Wherever you look, especially across Western society, you have regressive fantasies of returns to the pre-modern. You can look at something like the counterculture, the 60s counterculture, going and living on a commune. You can look at neo-paganism. You can look at New Age belief systems. All of these seem relatively harmless in good times. They're simply things that people are doing, distracting themselves, harmless pleasures, getting dressed up as a pagan. Lie role-playing hobbit characters in the forests of wherever it is. What could be the problem with these harmless fantasies? The problem comes when the modern project collapses in one form or another. I suspect what Vladimir Putin, and to an extent the Chinese, are gambling on at the moment is that the West, which it is currently facing as a terrifying opponent, is facing a very large potential economic collapse. We're hyper overextended economically, and then a collapse of its population back into pre-modern myths that may well be fascist. That it's not necessary for the fascist fantasy of Eurasia to conquer all these nations. The people might simply rise up when their own versions of modernity fail them and join together into this fascist fantasy. I think this is a genuine risk that lies ahead of us. If the history of the 20th century has taught us anything, is that there is this very powerful drawback to the pre-modern for nearly all of us, because the structures of modern society are alienating. Many of us don't know where we fit into these structures. We pursue fame, we align with political parties, we join causes, but our own identities are lost. Our communities no longer seem to exist. We seem more and more alienated from our families. And so people are drawn back to the idea that they could live in a pre-modern way. Think about that. Just think about how widespread that is across our society and what could happen if our society has a very bad fall from the state of modernity that we have reached. And the postmodern vision, of course, seems for many, most, or maybe even all people, completely like its own fantasy. It seems like the postmodern transhuman philosophies are delusional. Now, I don't share this. I studied postmodernism at university. I then forgot it and was surprised to see it come back into the world. But I forgot it. I'd thought about it in many different directions, actually. A lot of my early science fiction writing is postmodern in its ideologies and structures. I'm thinking a lot about escape from the human condition. But I don't think that I can persuade the millions of people who are completely flummoxed by postmodernism to give that up, at least not in this podcast. But I think there is another hope. And I think that hope lies in new mythic stories like Lord of the Rings. Not new chronologically, of course. It's some 70 years old or so now. But Lord of the Rings is a newly created mythos to answer the very question that we are facing. So at this point, I am going to put aside this question, is Lord of the Rings a fascist fantasy? I'm going to say absolutely not. And I hope perhaps that this can be a reference because these discussions never go away. There will always be people of a particularly modernist mindset who will critique Lord of the Rings on this basis that is trying to tempt us back to fascism. But what Lord of the Rings actually is, well, it's a number of things. One is a critique of the failings of every part of our society. It critiques the pre-modern. If you look at, Denethor and Boromir, the wardens of Gondor, who are not the true kings, which is the symbolism of the critique, and the way that they, reflect the failings of the aristocratic class and of myths in general, when Denethor sends Faramir out into the charge against the orc armies minus Morgul. I haven't reached this part in my reread yet, so forgive me where I'm factually incorrect. This is the incompetent aristocrats of the British commanders in World War I sending the men against the machine guns. The criticism of all the pre-modern stuff that collapses back into the fascist fantasy is all there in Tolkien. We know it's an internet meme that Tolkien wrote to a Nazi publisher and said, no, I am not going to support you. I do not support in any way Nazi Germany. I think it's pretty clear from Tolkien's writing, from who he was as a man, from the time he lived, that he was probably a high Tory in his thinking. High Tories don't like fascists at all, but they can have a tendency to collapse back into the pre-modern. A high Tory is someone who, adores the Church of England in the English sense, British village life, cricket. I like high Tories generally when I talk and sit with them. They're good-hearted people. I don't think they have completely the right answer. And Tolkien was a good-hearted man, absolutely. Look, the critique of the modern is there as well. Saruman, this power-hungry technology user, killing all the trees to build more weapons, genetically engineering a new kind of orc. All the critiques of modernism there and of postmodernism. What are the elves but postmodern beings, immortal, beyond the boundaries of physical mortal reality, able to sail away to wherever it is across the seas, but also cowardly, also not dealing with the problems of the world. The pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern are all critiqued by Tolkien. And what is Tolkien's solution? What Tolkien talks about throughout Lord of the Rings is the integration of these different ways of living. When the king returns, when Aragorn returns to the throne, he is not a tribal lord. He is the wise king who integrates all of the different peoples of Middle-earth into one. Those peoples symbolizing not different nations, but different psychologies, different states of civilization, the pre-modern, the modern, and the postmodern. Tolkien was really a brilliant integral thinker. If you're not familiar with integral theory or developmental stage theory, you can go and look those up. You can look up integral theory. It's not very important to this discussion, other than to say that Tolkien, I think because of his suffering in World War I, his great learnings, his clear-eyed view of what the world was, had become an integral thinker. But maybe a better way to say this is that Tolkien understood the need for wisdom. Aragorn is the wise king, and Middle-earth is saved by the counsels of the wise. It is saved by Gandalf and Galadriel, who are the figures of wisdom, that we must cultivate wisdom. And again, Tolkien, who was a wise human being, expresses the values of wisdom in Lord of the Rings. Maybe most emotionally, devastatingly, when he has Gandalf talk about why they must have empathy for Smeagol, the Gollum. And that informs Frodo's thinking. All the times he might have killed Gollum, but he doesn't. In part because Frodo is also wise, but he has been advised by the wisdom of Gandalf. And of course, it is the act of compassion which saves the world. The fascist fantasy is not wise in any way. It is power hungry. It is striving to grasp the one ring of power that Tolkien is wise enough to tell us we must not grasp. We must not even pick it up. Wisdom lies in not taking power and then in helping the world through ways other than brute power. And what are these other symbols that we have here? We have most of all Sauron, the one who grasps the power and the One Ring. And what Tolkien identifies masterfully with great wisdom is that there is no enemy in the world other than the person who grasps for power. And what the fascist fantasy tells those who it belittles and demeans and tortures and forces into its power and deludes. It tells them that there is an evil that can be defeated by the dictator who has grasped the One Ring, who is the strong man who's going to fight for them, who is the Stalin, who is the Hitler, who is the Putin. And this is the lie of the fascist fantasy. And Lord of the Rings does everything to defuse and defeat that fantasy. And I feel certain that Lord of the Rings' existence in the world is part of why so much of the world isn't slipping back into the fascist fantasy, but is instead trying to work towards wisdom. And look at the tremendous wisdom on display now, perhaps too late, but on display in the response of the world to Vladimir Putin. Not the rush to war, not the rush to condemn the Russian people, although there has been perhaps a little too much of that. Instead, the wise response to simply put all the walls we can around Putin and to work through peaceful means to get rid of him. That is a wise response. And I think Tolkien and his mythos of Lord of the Rings and Middle-earth have played a huge part in educating us in that wisdom. And a final point on behalf of Lord of the Rings. Another thread that I have pursued for the Science Fiction Podcast in its first year, the unreal, and our transition into many kinds of unreality through the internet, digital technology, the metaverse, virtual realities, video games, massively multiplayer online role-playing games. In so many ways, at accelerating speed, we are traveling into the unreal. A transition which holds great risks and great potentials. And what are we choosing to do in the unreal? We're choosing to go and live in the fantasy worlds that Tolkien defined. Perhaps we're doing a little bit too much fighting in them, but maybe virtual fighting is a wise thing that stops us doing real fighting. And I have a great hope and an optimism that in the face of its critics who are still out there, in the face of those who belittle it as merely fantasy, as those of you who are members of the Facebook community for this podcast know, the science fiction community on Facebook, I have little to no time for the argument that Lord of the Rings is not also great science fiction because it does all the things that we need from science fiction. It is this beautiful critique and then synthesis of our modern world. And if we shape our unreal realms around only one thing, I'm sure it would be more than one, but if it was to be only one, we couldn't make a better decision than the fantasy realms of Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings and the wisdom of JRR Tolkien. Thank you for listening for so long. If you are still here, this is the Science Fiction Podcast with Damien G. Walter. You can go and become a member at damiengwalter.com. You can join the conversation on the science fiction community on Facebook. Thank you very much for your patience with this episode. I hope it is useful for you and brings you some hope in what are quite dark times.